If you think modern prisons are cruel, wait till you hear how people were tortured back in the medieval days.
Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey is a medieval torture device used to punish women accused of witchcraft, adultery, or other crimes. It is a wooden device shaped like a triangular horse with a sharp edge. The woman would be forced to sit on top of the device with her legs spread apart, and weights would be attached to her feet, causing excruciating pain and potentially even death. Breast ripper. The breast ripper was a torture device used primarily on women accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft. It was a metal tool consisting of 4 sharp claws that were heated before being applied to the breasts of the victim. The claws would be slowly tightened, causing intense pain and sometimes even ripping the breast off the victim. Scold's bridle. The scold's bridle, also known as the brank or the gossip's bridle, was a device used to punish women accused of being too talkative or spreading rumors. The device was a metal mask that covered the woman's face with a protruding tongue depressor that prevented her from speaking. The device would often be worn in public as a form of humiliation. Cutting women in half with a chainsaw. In the medieval ages, hanging women upside down and sawing them in half at the genitals was a cheap and easy way to inflict maximum suffering. All you needed was a strong pair of biceps and a lack of morals. Convicted witches, adulterers, and blasphemers were the usual targets. Pair of anguish. The pair of anguish, also known as the poire d'angoisse, was a torture device used to punish women accused of adultery or other sexual crimes. It was a pear-shaped metal instrument that would be inserted into the vagina, anus, or mouth, and then expanded using a screw mechanism, causing extreme pain and potentially even death. Burning witches. This punishment was a form of execution used during the witch trials in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Women accused of witchcraft were tied to a stake and burned alive in public. The belief was that witches had made a pact with the devil and could perform magic, and their execution was meant to rid the community of evil spirits.
The Catherine wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, was one of the most popular forms of punishment back in medieval Europe. According to ancient records, the Catherine wheel was only reserved for the most rotten, wicked criminals of society. Hangings, beheadings, and burning at the stake just weren't enough for these people. So, they had to be put through extreme pain and torture, while also giving people something to be afraid of whenever they even thought of committing serious crimes such as theft and murder. The Catherine wheel was used in many different periods and evolved into many different forms, but the basic idea of this contraption was to break the limbs of whoever was put in the wheel, causing them an unbelievable amount of pain until their bodies just couldn't handle it anymore. Legend has it that this torture wheel was first used on St. Catherine of Alexandria, and hence is named after her. During the reign of the Roman Empire, St. Catherine was captured and tortured when she refused to give up her Christian beliefs and faith, and after that, the wheel just became a conventional form of torture, with more and more empires using it throughout Europe. First, the wheel was a method of extracting information from criminals because of the kind of pain it could inflict on them. However, sometimes in the Middle Ages, it started to be used as a form of execution instead of just torture. Now, the way the wheel would originally work was the convicted person would lie down on the road and a wagon would run them over, breaking their entire body. But then, because of all the logistics, the wagon was reduced to a single wheel that would be used to essentially do the same thing: break all the bones, limbs, and the spine of the criminal, who would then die from the pain and agony left on display on the spokes of the wheel for people to watch. The Catherine wheel was made out of a large wooden wagon wheel that consisted of tons of radial spokes. Anybody sentenced to the punishment would be lashed to the wheel. Sometimes the criminals would be tied to the wheel and beaten with an iron cudgel while the wheel was spinning, so the victim never knew where the next blow would come from. The way the wheel would be used was determined by the kind of sentence that the criminal had received. For less serious crimes, the perpetrators would be treated with mercy and killed instantly with a couple of hits. This method was known as coup de grace and was meant to give the victims a quick death, shortening the time that they would be in pain. However, for the more heinous criminals, they would be tortured for days on end, with every bone in their body broken, after which they would be left to starve and die on display on the breaking wheel. The victims' bodies would be then displayed on the wheel for days, and sometimes these people would actually be alive, waiting for someone to come and offer them a sip of water so they could survive. No one did anything but watch man after man die on this cursed wheel. Back in the day, every European country had its own version of the Catherine wheel, with the sole purpose of torturing criminals to the point of no return. Eventually, this form of punishment was declared too inhumane and was replaced by hanging and firing squads, which were less graphic and violent punishments for people committing crimes. Pretty strange to know that the very invention that revolutionized travel was also an invention that is responsible for some of the cruelest deaths the world has seen, right? An ancient torture device designed to make death slow and unbearable. In this video, we're taking a look at the Brazen Bull. The idea of using torture as a form of control has been prevalent for as long as mankind has existed. Throughout history, countless tyrants have come up with their own mechanisms and devices to instill fear within the people and to punish those who went against the rules. But the Brazen Bull has by far been the worst of them all. Our story starts in ancient Greece somewhere around 560 BC when modern-day Sicily, then known as Acragas, was under the rule of a cruel tyrant named Phalaris. The leader was actually so cruel that the people believed he enjoyed torture and even went as low as to eat human children just to satisfy his bloodlust. So, either to make sure that his reign went unthreatened or just to satiate his taste for torturing others, Phalaris asked his court sculptor to make him a glass replica of a bull, which seemed like a pretty simple request. However, this was no ordinary statue. The bull was built to be entirely hollow on the inside, large enough to contain a human inside. And why was that? Well, that was because this bull was meant to be a torture device designed by the king himself. The idea was that anyone who displeased Phalaris would be put inside the bull. Then, a fire would be lit below the belly of the bull to slowly heat the metal up, burning the person inside. But that's not all. The fumes that would escape outside of the bull's nostrils were masked by incense within the statue to make sure that no one could smell the burning human flesh. Inside the bull was a mix of tubes and pipes that would somehow conceal the sound of the person yelling and screaming, and instead to the people outside would just sound like a roar of a bull. This was a feature that Phalaris specifically requested, and it was reported that the roar was the tyrant's favorite part of the punishment. It is said that when the sculptor Perilos pitched the idea of the bull to Phalaris, he told him that your victim will be punished and you will enjoy the music, which is exactly what the cruel tyrant did. Once the bull was completed, Phalaris actually threw the sculpture inside the own creation and burned him to test out whether his torture device worked or not, because that's how ruthless this king really was. But Phalaris let the sculpture out right before he died and instead decided to kill him by throwing him off a cliff for some unknown reason. Some people believe that Phalaris killed the sculpture because he was appalled at how his mind could have come up with the idea of such a genius torture device. So, to make sure that he never thought of anything more dangerous, the king decided to kill him once and for all. When Phalaris started using the Brazen Bull, at the end of every punishment, he would collect the bones of his victims and make jewelry out of them, which the king would then wear as a display of dominance and power. However, things came full circle in an unfortunate way when the city of Sicily was overthrown by Telemachus in 554 BC, and Phalaris was actually roasted to death in his very own torture device, bringing an end to his cruel leadership. However, the idea of the Brazen Bull had already become widespread by then. The Romans, as well as the Greeks, have been reported to have used similar torture devices against their own enemies. Some of the world's most famous Christian saints in the world, such as Saint Eustace and Saint Antipas, are said to have been killed using the Brazen Bull, which just goes to show how deadly this creation has proven to be throughout history.
Stoning to death. This punishment involves throwing stones at a person until they die. Women were often stoned to death for adultery or other perceived violations of Islamic or cultural laws in some societies. Republican marriage. This punishment was used during the French Revolution as a way to punish women who were accused of being counter-revolutionaries. The women were forced to marry a man who was considered a good citizen or a patriot, and the marriage was often used as a way to monitor her behavior. The iron chair. This punishment involves a person being strapped to a chair made of iron spikes which pierce through their flesh. Pain is intense, and the victim may be left to die slowly. The iron chair was a form of punishment used in Europe during the Middle Ages. Catherine's wheel. This punishment involves a person being tied to a large wheel and then being beaten or crushed with a club or hammer. The Catherine's wheel was a form of punishment used in medieval Europe for women accused of adultery or other crimes. Foot binding. This was a practice in China where young girls' feet were bound tightly with a cloth to prevent them from growing. The practice was done to make women's feet appear small and delicate, which was seen as a sign of beauty and status. However, foot binding resulted in permanent deformity and disability for many women. Female circumcision, also known as female genital mutilation, FGM. It is a practice where the female genitalia are cut, injured, or removed for non-medical reasons. FGM is often performed on young girls and women in some cultures as a way to control their sexuality, maintain family honor, or prepare them for marriage. The practice can cause severe physical and psychological harm to women and has been widely condemned by human rights organizations.
There are things that Islam says have to be done. Cutting nails, cutting the clitoris, and cutting pubic hair.
Throughout history, a number of insane punishment methods have been used by humans. In today's episode, we'll take a look at a bone-chilling punishment called the Cradle of Judah. During the medieval ages in China, a popular execution method was called Ling Chi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This method involved tying up a person to a wooden pole and slicing off flaps of their skin and limbs one by one through a sharp knife. The executioner sometimes would cut off the victim's fingers by each joint, but oftentimes they would just cut off the entire limb at once. Death from this method was extremely painful and gradual, and so the method became successful in reducing the crime rate in medieval China. Another unimaginable torture method was known as scaphism, which emerged in ancient Persia and was considered to be the most disgusting punishment ever. To be executed by this method, a person was laid down in a wooden boat and was then covered with another boat from upside so that his limbs and head would remain outside. He was then forcefully fed a lot of honey and milk in order to provoke diarrhea and was left to float on stagnant water. Soon enough, flies and other dangerous insects would be drawn to the smell of feces and honey, stinging and laying eggs on the victim's head and limbs. This punishment continued for weeks. The victim eventually died of dehydration and insect bites. However, if you thought these punishments were the height of cruelty, you might want to reconsider because the worst is yet to come. The Cradle of Judah was actually a sadistic chair that no one would want to sit on. It looked more like a stool with 3 or 4 legs and a flat base resting on the top of these legs. On that base was a pyramid-shaped iron piece with a very sharp and pointed top, joined strongly with the stool base. As per the historical records, it was first invented in Spain in the early 16th century and then quickly spread to other parts of the world. Though there were a few different variants of this chair around the world as well, the core principle was the same for all. In order to be executed, the victim was forced to sit on the top of the chair in such a way that the point of the pyramid would be directed at his rear orifice. If it was a woman, she might be forced to sit with the point on her vaginal orifice. The victim was then tied with ropes and gradually lowered onto the spike using natural gravity. The punishment often started at night, and the victim was left on the chair till the morning. Most of the victims died of the excruciating pain and the excess bleeding, and even if some of them survived the penetration, the wounds were so severe that they would later die of the infections inside their anus. These infections were caused due to the lack of cleaning of the pyramid's top, resulting in the previous victim's blood and bodily remains being present. The chair was often used for interrogation rather than execution. It proved to be an extremely successful method for extracting information from anyone, as only the thought of sitting on that scary chair would make anyone spill the beans. At times, additional weights were tied to the victim's legs in order to make the penetration process quick and more painful. The torturers applied different other tactics as well in order to make the process a lot more unsettling. In France, they had a practice where the victims were forced to clench their muscles in order not to faint and experience maximum pain. And if a person would still faint after enduring enough pain, he would be taken off the chair only to be brought back on it after waking up. Historians often argue about when these chairs were used and on whom. Though the historical records are not clear, the remaining chairs of that time exhibited in European museums prove that the punishment existed for sure. According to several historians, a similar kind of punishment was common in some parts of Asia as well, notably in Thailand and Sri Lanka. There it was called the bamboo torture, in which the victim was tied over a fast-growing bamboo root that grew straight into his body. The Cradle of Judah is enough to send a chill down anyone's spine even in today's modern age. Thankfully, humans have come out of such a dark phase, and such punishment methods do not exist today.
Uncover the brutal reality of white torture, where the walls, the light, and silence consume your mind, body, and soul. White torture is a form of enhanced interrogation technique that is characterized by extreme sensory deprivation. It's a technique that strips a person of their identity and leaves them in a state of constant confusion and isolation. Imagine being locked in a completely white cell for months on end. The walls, floor, and ceiling are white, your clothes are white, and the light is always bright and white. It's like being trapped in a never-ending snowstorm, except the snow is made of paint and the cold is replaced by a suffocating heat. The only food you're given is white rice on a white plate. You never hear any voices except the ones in your head. One person who experienced this was Amir Fakhravar, a former prisoner in Iran.
I was in jail for more than 5 years, 5 years and 3 months, and 8 months solitary confinement under torture.
He was an activist who was critical of the Iranian regime and was imprisoned and interrogated on several occasions.
A lot of signs from tortures, and they broke my wrist during the solitary confinement.
But he said that nothing was as brutal as the white torture. He was lucky to make it out alive, as many other prisoners in Evin prison in Iran have been tortured to death. Iranian journalist Ibrahim Nabavi described this experience of white torture in the way that, "Since I left Evin, I have not been able to sleep without sleeping pills. It is terrible. The loneliness never leaves you long after you are free. Every door that is closed on you, this is why we call it white torture. As you sit in the white cell, the silence begins to weigh heavily on you. You can't tell if it's night or day. The only way you know that time is passing is by the delivery of your white rice and by the moments when you are allowed to use the bathroom. But even then, the guards wear padded shoes so you don't ever hear them coming. It's as if you're trapped in a dream where you are the only person left in the world. The only thing you can focus on is the whiteness that surrounds you. It's like a white fog that's slowly consuming your mind. You start to see things that aren't there, patterns and shapes that you can't explain. You begin to question your own sanity. But then, just as you're on the brink of losing yourself completely, the door to your cell opens and you're taken out. But it's not to be released. It's for interrogation. The interrogators don't need to use physical force because, by this point, your mind has been broken. But once the interrogation is over, you're thrown back into the white cell and the cycle starts again. They get what they want without having to hit you. You begin to break. And once you break, they have control, and then you begin to confess. But it's not just Iran that uses this form of torture. Human rights organizations have reported that it has been used by the CIA in their enhanced interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay and other black sites such as secret prisons in Thailand. Techniques included keeping men in stress positions for days, waterboarding, and confining them to small boxes where they couldn't properly sit. It's not just the physical scars that remain, but the psychological ones as well. The victim may struggle with anxiety, depression, insomnia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of torture is something that only happens in faraway countries, but it's important to remember that it can happen anywhere. We must bring attention to this form of torture and hold those responsible for their actions. This video is just a small piece of the bigger puzzle, and we encourage you to do your own research and become more informed about this and other forms of torture. It's essential that we speak out against these human rights violations and bring attention to the victims of white torture. Their voices should not be silenced by whiteness that consumed their lives.
Being a pirate meant that you had to navigate through rough waters and go without food or water for days, all while having a short lifespan because of the possibility of being captured. In this video, we're taking a look at keel hauling. For those of you who are unfamiliar with any kind of marine lingo, keel is usually referred to as the bottom of the ship. Now, the keel in itself isn't a torture device because, well, it's just a flat blade sticking down into the water from the bottom of a ship. But the way that it was used back then has given it the reputation of being one of the most torturous punishments that mankind has ever been put through. Keel hauling was a punishment and execution method that was used all the way up to the mid-19th century before it was declared inhumane and cruel. However, in the time that it was used, keel hauling would instill fear in the hearts of anyone who would set sail on the seven seas. Along with walking the plank, keel hauling is one of the most popular punishments that was given to and by the deadliest pirates that sailed across the oceans. Keel hauling refers to when criminals were dragged beneath the ship's keel on a rope as a way to torture them with excruciating pain long enough for them to die a slow, horrible death. This form of punishment is said to have been popular back in the 17th and 18th centuries. The punishment would start off with the victim being suspended by a rope from the mast of the ship. To make sure that they couldn't possibly escape, a weight would be tied to their legs. Then, when the crew members would push the victim off the mast, they would fall to the sea and the ship would start moving, dragging the person along the keel. The victim would often be stripped and tied up so they couldn't swim, and they would then be fastened with 2 ropes. A lot of the time, the crew members would drop the victim and then tug on the second rope to get the victim to touch the hull so that the torture would begin. Now, obviously, this would result in injuries not only because the keel was sharp, but also because it would be covered with sharp barnacles that would pierce into the victim's skin. These small cuts would then lead to infections, and the victim would have no choice but to keep suffering until their slow death gets to them. Keel hauling would even lead to decapitation in a lot of the cases, with the speed of movement of the ship being crucial to the kind of torture that the victim would have to endure. In a lot of the cases, the crew members would stuff the victim's mouth with an oil-soaked sponge to make breathing harder underwater. Because of how gruesome it was, records show that keel hauling wasn't just used on a regular basis. Why? Well, because it was only reserved for the worst of the worst and stood to deliver a message and warning to anyone who might be tempted to partake in things like theft. Most people believe that keel hauling was a method of torture used by pirates to kill their victims and steal their possessions, but evidence suggests that pirates practiced keel hauling way less in comparison to British, Dutch, and French militaries who wanted to teach their crew a lesson in the case of an unforgivable crime. So the primary goal of the punishment wasn't to kill the accused. It was to scare them and bring them just close enough to death to absolutely terrify them. However, the surviving victims wouldn't be brought up on the ship immediately and would be left to hang on the yardarm for several hours and even days sometimes to serve as a warning for all the sailors watching. However, if the captain of the ship wasn't happy with the kind of injuries that the victim had suffered, the process would be repeated all over again, showing just how deadly the practice really got at times. Considering all of this, modern sailors discontinued the use of keel hauling as a punishment simply because the practice was unnecessarily cruel. And while there aren't enough records to show exactly where and when the practice originated from, as fictional as it might sound, keel hauling was definitely one of the worst forms of punishment ever invented by human beings. A torture device designed to kill people in the slowest, most painful way possible. In this video, we're looking at the Iron Maiden. The existence of the Iron Maiden is pretty perplexing, and no, we're not talking about the world's greatest heavy metal band right now. While there are no actual accounts of this device being used to punish criminals and prisoners back in medieval times, there's certainly plenty of evidence that points to their existence, and we owe it all to a man named Matthew Peacock. Peacock spent his life collecting old paintings and gizmos. After taking a deep dive into the medieval era, he managed to piece together what we know now as the Iron Maiden. So, what exactly did this torture device look like, and what did it do? The Iron Maiden was essentially a casket with spikes on the inside so that when it would be closed, the spikes would slowly dig into the victim's body, impaling them on the spot. The form of torture is said to have originated in Germany. The Iron Maiden was designed for both torture and execution. The device featured 2 sets of spikes. The longer ones would immediately pierce the victim as soon as the lid was closed. These would stab through their wrists and ankles, crucifying and nailing the person down so they couldn't move or push back. Then the shorter spikes would push into their thighs, shoulders, and arms. Now, if you notice, none of these spikes stab areas like the heart that would directly kill the victim. Why? Well, because the point was to punish them with a slow, torturous death, keeping them in pain for the longest possible time. Then, with one final push, the lid of the device would press down with the smallest spikes, penetrating the victim's eyes, throat, and then going into his heart and brain, finally putting an end to the agony. Rumor has it that the device was actually just an interaction of a 2,200-year-old device described by the Greek historian Polybius, who wrote about the 2nd and 3rd century Spartan leader Nabi, who loved his wife Apega so much that he had a metal replica of her made. But what's strange is that the replica wasn't just for display. The arms and hands along with the breast of the replica were covered with iron nails. Whenever someone would refuse to pay their taxes or commit a crime, they would be forced to give the metal structure a hug until they died or paid up. But the tricky part is that there are practically no historical accounts of the Iron Maiden actually being used. The earliest record that points to the existence of the device dates back to the 1700s when German philosopher Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote about a coin forger being executed using the Iron Maiden. And that's when museums all over Europe and the USA started imagining their own designs of the device and putting them on display. Speaking of Europe, there are plenty of folktales that speak of people being placed inside casks instead of caskets, with their heads poking out so that people could see them in their misery. Once the nails would be driven into their bodies and the torture began, the casks would be rolled down a steep hill and sometimes into the water, making the whole thing 10 times worse, leaving the victim withering in agony and pain as they died a slow death, either by the stab wounds or by the suffocation underwater. The only actual evidence of an Iron Maiden was sadly found partly destroyed by Allied bombers, but it was enough for the Museum of Crime in Rothenburg to replace the design and make a copy that showed exactly how the victims were tortured using this inhumane contraption with strategically placed spikes. And while the existence of the Iron Maiden might never be confirmed, if we know one thing about people in the Middle Ages, it's that they had a taste for torture. So there's really no reason for such a cruel device not to have been used back then, as terrifying as it was. Do you think the Iron Maiden is a myth or something more than that? See you next time with something new, and until then, goodbye.